My lady, for 5 years now, the Covid Bereaved Families have campaigned for justice for their loved ones who lost their lives during the pandemic, starting with the calls for the establishment of this inquiry, and have played an incredibly active and engaged role in each and every of the 8 modules which they've been granted core participant status. Their focus has been to establish the truth as to what has happened to their loved ones, and to seek answers from decision makers for policies and practices which may have contributed to their deaths and thousands of others. It is now in Module 10 that the inquiry turns its focus onto the bereaved families as bereaved and the impact of the pandemic on them, recognising, as it must, that the bereaved have their own vulnerabilities, their own suffering and their own needs. We therefore welcome the inquiry's provisional outline of scope and the commitment to addressing how the COVID bereaved were impacted and what the protective and risk factors were for poor bereavement outcomes, and how the restrictions affected mourning rituals and how it affected access to bereavement support. As the inquiry's own roundtable on funerals, burials and bereavement support identified, the peer support provided by bereaved family campaign groups is essential for many of those who lost loved ones during the pandemic, with people often not knowing where else to turn. And being part of a bereaved family campaign group has helped many people to feel understood and begin to make sense of what has happened to their loved ones and to them during the pandemic. This support has often been in the face of a vacuum of any form of official bereavement support and an inability for the bereaved to be able to perform significant family, cultural or religious rituals to mark their loved one's passing. And bereaved families have experienced a lack of autonomy and choice as rules and restrictions limited the size and conduct of funerals, and have expressed their views to your round table that investigations and inquests into their loved ones' deaths were rushed and superficial. And this leads me to my first substantive submission for this preliminary hearing, picking up on our paragraph 19 of our written submissions, the question of how the inquiry approaches the evidence of the bereaved. In our submission, because this module is focused on the bereaved as bereaved, it must be grounded within evidence of their lived experience, not just through the Every Story Matters and roundtable contributions, but in oral evidence delivered in public hearings. We recognise that Module 10, like every module, has its timetable constraints, but we invite the inquiry to adopt creative and collaborative approaches to maximise the voices of the bereaved people in this module, whether through panels of witnesses, as in the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry, or by calling a number of bereaved people across expanded oral evidence hearings. CBFFJ and Northern Irish CBFFJ are ready to collaborate with the inquiry to adopt those creative processes. My second substantive point is about the experience of the bereaved and the need for expert evidence. As paragraph 7 of our written submissions, we repeat our request for the inquiry to obtain expert evidence touching upon the experience of the bereaved, which in our submission should include the psychological, emotional and social consequences of bereavement in the pandemic. This point would, in our submission, be best addressed by a psychologist, both with clinical and a research record in the area of complex grief arising from major incidents and or public health crises. The individual bereaved can, of course, give you their experience and their impact, but what's missing in our submission is an understanding of how grief in a pandemic, in a complex, fast-moving and highly traumatic environment has a particular impact on individuals. And that's what we say the inquiry should best understand through expert evidence. In our submission, the inquiry should also understand the cumulative impact of bereavement when funeral restrictions are in place, financial hardship and social inequality, that kind of complex grief pattern that has affected so many. And that includes, of course, individual experiences of structural discrimination, both predating and exacerbated by the pandemic. And the third point is around the availability, accessibility and efficacy of bereavement support services. My lady, we don't yet know how and to what degree that's going to be covered by the systemic evidence review. We understand that hope to be available by today. We're going to receive that in the coming weeks. Miss Blackwell, King's Counsel, has updated us this morning. But we understand that that's largely a paper review, no doubt a thorough one, but we maintain that specific expert evidence is still necessary in those 3 core areas. And if I made two additional short points on experts, we support the submissions of the clinically vulnerable families, which call for the instructions of Dr. Christina Pagal and Dr. Duncan Robertson, and the need for bespoke expert evidence on the impact of the pandemic on clinically vulnerable people. And we also welcome the suggestion made by the domestic abuse groups that given the degree of intersectionality in the impact of structural discrimination, which exacerbated inequalities during the pandemic and led to an increased risk of death for many marginalised groups, that the experts instructed should have the opportunity to discuss their findings and any areas of shared understanding on impact before finalising their reports. Ms Blackwell, King's Counsel, made the point this morning, a question about what would that add. Well, in our submission, the experience of the bereaved in particular is cross-cutting, relevant to many themes included in the expert evidence, including mental health, well-being, religious worship, faith communities, key workers and the justice system. And this understanding of these cross-cutting issues would only be enhanced by an expert roundtable. That is the added value that we say would be brought to this process. My third substantive point, my lady, is around specific evidence on the systemic impact on bereavement support, the obtaining of further witness evidence. As set out in paragraph 10 of our written submissions, we are concerned that there will be limited evidence by way of an overview of bereavement support provision across the UK and how that changed during the pandemic. We understand from counsel to the inquiry and updates that there's been no specific request for a witness statement from a bereavement support provider or an expert who can give an overview of the provision or address recommendations for change. We note the findings of the UK Commission on Bereavement, recently disclosed by the inquiry, which makes helpful recommendations based on high-level evidence of roundtables and surveys. But there is still in our submission nothing that informs the inquiry directly about how bereavement support was actually delivered during the pandemic. What were the operational challenges? What were the daily challenges on the ground? What was the impact on those delivering that support and those needing the support? So we maintain that what is still needed is direct witness evidence via a statement from a frontline organisation such as Cruise or Cruise Scotland, who have both contributed at a high level to those roundtable processes. And we've set out at our paragraph 12 as what any additional evidence should specifically address. The risk is, in our submission, that the high-level evidence from the Commission and from the round tables can only take a broad brush approach and will not enable the inquiry to make meaningful and focused recommendations that will be able to catalyse any real systemic change. Staying with roundtable recommendations for a moment, this leads me to my fourth substantive point regarding post-death investigations. The final recommendations of the roundtable on funerals, burials and post-bereavement support is that complaints procedures for organisations that bereaved people interacted with at the time of their loved one's death, such as healthcare providers and coroners, should be more simple and empathetic and should ensure that there is accountability to avoid exacerbating the pain and anger that bereaved people experienced. This is one of the only mentions of the experiences of the bereaved with post-death investigations, which have been a great source of distress and trauma for so many. We welcomed the request to the Covid Bereaved Families for Justice UK in the Rule 9 process for evidence that they could assist the inquiry with of the impact of the pandemic on access to and experience of post-death investigation mechanisms, including coroner's inquests. And we understand from Ms Blackwell, King Council's update this morning, that the impact as understood by the bereaved is relevant to this module. But we underline our submission that a witness statement should be sought from the Chief Coroner of England and Wales and the Coroner's Service for Northern Ireland and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal in Scotland on the impact of the pandemic on those services. Ms Blackwell's update this morning was that the operation of the coroner's courts is outside of scope. Yet we note from the provisional list of issues it expressly includes consideration of how pandemic restrictions and measures introduced in response impacted on people's experience of the justice system and courts. But for bereaved families, the coronial system and coroner's courts were sadly a key part of their pandemic experience. In our submission, seeking to understand how the criminal, civil and family courts were impacted by the pandemic and not investigating the impact of the pandemic restrictions on the coronial system and seeking evidence from those responsible for its oversight is to miss an important part of the jigsaw and the most important part of the jigsaw for the bereaved families. Bereaved families can only share their individual experiences with the inquiry, and without further evidence, the inquiry will not have a full understanding of what steps the process would ordinarily follow outside pandemic times, what systemic changes came about as the result of the pandemic, and what the impacts were as far as the operation of the system within the restrictions and limitations that were imposed upon it, and whether any learning and reflections have been reached as a result. We also note and endorse the written submissions of the disabled people's organisations at their paragraph 1.5 in respect of the impact of the pandemic on the reporting of deaths in care settings and of those receiving care at home, and the fact that the lack of inquests during the pandemic left bereaved relatives with unanswered questions and a lack of support. And we also endorse the suggestion by the domestic abuse groups at their paragraph 9 of their written submissions that a statement be sought from the Legal Aid Practitioners Group, which, in our submission, could also address issues regarding access to representation and engagement of families to coroners' courts. My lady, by way of conclusion of my short submissions, the legacy of the last pandemic is not just how governments and society responded to a public health crisis and a developing understanding of what led to hundreds of thousands of COVID-related deaths. The legacy for our society is how we cared for the dying, how we honoured and buried the dead, and how we comforted the bereaved, how we sought to answer the questions they asked, the questions that public bodies ought to have been asking themselves with candour. The lessons for the next pandemic must go beyond recommendations for more tissues and sympathy for the bereaved, for those who felt the hardest impact of this pandemic, for those who lost their loved ones or had their lives changed forever by COVID-19. The inquiry in its final module must be able to look the bereaved in the eyes, hold their gaze and be prepared to ask the most searching questions. Because the measure of our society is how we learn from the experiences of those we have lost, ensuring the devastating impact that's been felt by millions of people can lead to meaningful change. Thank you, my lady. Those are my submissions.
Very grateful, Ms Morris. Thank you very much indeed.